Hi, this lecture is best suited for those who are interested in getting the most out of their computers. If you're looking to upgrade or buy a new workstation, this lecture is going to help you out. If that's not the case, feel free to skip it because there's a lot of technical information. The first thing you should aim for is 8 to 16 gigabytes of RAM. From my experience, anything over 16 won't do you any good unless you're a professional who's using the program for a living. RAM frequency doesn't matter, so don't focus on it. Quantity is essential. I suggest you use Firefox as your main browser because it doesn't eat up as much RAM as Chrome. If you're used to opening lots of tabs, you might want to try an extension called OneTab. There are various other alternatives. These help you free up RAM memory by saving all your tabs. When you need them, you can restore them one by one or all in one swoop. Let's move on to another subject, your graphics card. In short, it doesn't matter all that much. So if you're on a tight budget, you can use an Intel CPU, which has an integrated graphics card. This means you don't have to purchase a separate one, and that should save you quite a bit of money. Here's what I suggest if you're low on cash. Say you have $500. If you buy a $50 card, that takes your budget down to $450, which means you'll have to downgrade your RAM, your CPU, or something else. From my research, there seems to be a tipping point where if you spend a bit more, say an extra 30%, you can get up to 100% additional performance. This means you should not buy a low-end graphics card because it's not good value for money. It won't perform well, nor will you be able to sell it. Instead, get an Intel CPU and use those savings on things that can't be easily upgraded. For example, if you remove the GPU, this might mean you're able to jump from an i3 to an i5 CPU, which would make your workstation much more future-proof. You're basically eliminating an item from your shopping list, and that means you have a higher budget for all the other components. And Photoshop will run okay with an integrated graphics card. After you get some extra cash, buy a best-selling GPU, which is very likely great value for money. Again, in most cases, spending a bit more gives you dramatically better performance and/or value. As for your processor, this is a complicated subject, but here are my conclusions. For Photoshop, Intel processors are better than AMD ones, leaving the integrated graphics aside. So if you want the best processor for Photoshop, go with an Intel one. Now I'll get a bit more technical. That's my conclusion, even though AMD's Threadripper looks amazing. Even the Ryzen lineup seems fantastic if you consider the price-to-performance ratio. But here's the catch. Photoshop isn't optimized for multi-core use. That's the main advantage of AMD's chips. Actually, Photoshop seems to rely heavily on the frequency of one core. In general, Intel processors have higher clock speeds than those from AMD. My 7700K runs at 4.2 GHz out of the box, but the Ryzen 1800X runs at only 3.6. Plus, a lot of people are actually buying the 1700X and overclocking it to match the 1800, but it's still not ideal. Cheaper, yes, but not ideal. Note, here I'm no longer talking about cheap alternatives. This piece of advice applies to those who want the best. Photoshop cares who offers the higher clock speeds, and that's Intel. So it doesn't matter how many extra cores AMD gives you. Photoshop does not care. At least not the versions that came out up until this point. Plus, you can easily overclock Intel processors that have a K at the end. This means my computer is actually running at 4.8 GHz, which makes a big difference. Ryzen's can't be overclocked that much without serious effort. Overall, from what I've seen across the board, an Intel CPU will get you anywhere from a 10% increase in performance to about 25% when you compare it to an AMD one. There are also other benefits like higher build quality, brand reputation and whatnot, but those are debatable. The race is still going on, and by the time I finish recording this, AMD might have come out with something much better, but as it stands, that's not the case. If something changes, I'll add an update to this lecture. Let's move on. One of the major boosts you can give to your computer is installing an SSD. Most people know SSDs are considerably faster than regular hard disk drives, but here's the catch. If you want Photoshop to truly benefit from your lightning-fast SSD, you have to use it as a scratch disk. That's available immediately underneath Performance. Again, Ctrl-K is the hotkey. Scratch disks are used by Photoshop when you run out of RAM. The emptier it is, the better. That means you should install Photoshop and various other programs on your hard drive and keep your SSD mostly empty in order to use it as a scratch disk. I know it sounds counterintuitive, but installing Photoshop on your SSD won't make a noticeable difference in performance. In general, leaving Photoshop aside, most SSDs perform worse as you fill them up. Some argue that by having it over 50% full, you're slowing it down considerably. Of course, this varies from brand to brand, model to model. In case you have several partitions, which I don't encourage, you can enable them by checking their respective boxes. One solid piece of advice is to make sure you have them stacked in the correct order. So if your SSD is the third option on this list, enable it and use this arrow to place it at the top. Lastly, stay away from laptops unless you really need it. Laptops are a money pit and their performance is mediocre at best. I could spend at least half an hour on this subject, but here are the main points. The CPUs are vastly different and underpowered. So while it may say i7 on the box, it's a completely different CPU to what you get in a desktop computer. The difference in performance is night and day. The same applies to graphics cards. If you do a lot of research and pick a good GPU, it will drain your battery like crazy. I have an Ultrabook with one of the biggest batteries on the market. It's still not good enough for any half-decent work. It works well enough, but I would never use it as my daily driver. And the displays? In general, they're too small and most have inaccurate color renditions. A $2,000 laptop is miles behind a $2,000 desktop. But again, if you really need it because you travel a lot or whatever, then please do as much research as possible. In case you're curious, I have an Asus Ultrabook, a 15.6-inch ZenBook Pro UX501VW. The reasoning behind these underpowered components is simple: power usage and heat. If you've ever seen a modern CPU cooler combo, you know it's a huge thing. The same goes for your graphics cards, absolutely massive. Now, how can you fit all that power in something that's supposed to weigh the same as a pillow? So nobody is evil or trying to rip you off, it's just a trade you're making for the sake of mobility. Regarding Macs, I know a lot of professionals love their MacBooks or iMacs, but so far I haven't made the switch. I've seen several hardcore tech nerds like Linus from YouTube who've tried switching over for a few weeks or a month, but they've ultimately come back to their Windows-based machines. If they're so knowledgeable and so deep into tech, yet they still prefer a Windows machine, that makes me wonder. I don't want to stir up controversy, so please don't argue. These are just my opinions, and I'm sure there's a lot of pros of owning a Mac. I've actually ordered one, but I can't recommend it at this point. There are a lot of reasons for it, but in the end, for my daily driver, I'm sticking with my PC. I'm especially infuriated by the lack of transparency and the overpriced components. For example, Mac enthusiasts are all suggesting I buy a big SSD because you can't upgrade it. Ever. But those cost an arm and a leg, at least in Romania at official Apple stores. Not to mention, they don't tell me any specs. It's the same story with RAM, though thankfully after so many years I understand they've made that part upgradable. If you can afford a Mac, then that's great. But my recommendation for most people is to buy an Intel CPU on a Windows machine with 16 gigs of RAM, at least a 250GB SSD, preferably from Samsung, and a Best Buy graphics card. And that's it. I hope all these tips will help you out.